Serafina looked at her husband across the polished expanse of the mahogany dining table, her expression a careful construction of pity that felt sharper than any blade. The candlelight, meant to soften features, instead carved harsh shadows beneath her cheekbones, making her look like a beautiful, merciless statue. The entire Thorne family, her father, Marcus, at the head of the table, her brother Julian lounging beside her, was watching Liam. They were a pride of lions, and he was the strange, quiet creature that had wandered into their territory and overstayed its welcome. "You've become a financial burden, darling," she announced, her voice not loud but carrying with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. It was a statement delivered for the benefit of her audience, a performance of marital concern that was, in reality, an execution. Julian smirked into his wineglass. Marcus nodded slowly, a grave, patriarchal confirmation of the verdict. They had been circling this point all evening, with Julian's snide remarks about Liam's little freelance projects and Marcus's heavy sighs about the pressures of the current market. Now Serafina had delivered the killing blow. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend in their gilded echo chamber of inherited wealth and unshakable arrogance, was that the burden sitting before them had, that very morning, overseen the final transfer of funds for the first phase of his new project. The number that had flashed on his screen, a quiet confirmation in the solitude of his home office, was greater than the entire Thorne Industries' net profit from the previous fiscal year. The quiet architect they mocked, the man they viewed as a diminished version of his former self, was holding a signed contract in the simple leather folio beside his plate. A contract that represented a new epoch of architectural innovation and a personal fortune that would make their family's wealth look like a rounding error. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heat that prickled at Liam's neck, but it was distant, filtered through a profound and unshakable calm. He had been waiting for this moment, not hoping for it, but anticipating it with the same methodical precision he used to design the load-bearing structures of his buildings. He knew the foundation of his marriage had been eroding for months, and tonight he would finally see just how deep the cracks went. The performance, as he thought of it, was about to enter its final, dramatic act. Thank you for joining us for this story. We see you, and we appreciate you being here. If you enjoy stories about the underdog finding their strength and quiet dignity triumphing over loud arrogance, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. We love knowing where our stories are reaching, so drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's return to that dinner, to that table heavy with unspoken cruelty and the weight of a secret about to be revealed. The silence that followed Serafina's declaration was thick and suffocating. It was the sound of consensus. Liam felt their collective judgment settle upon him like a shroud. He slowly lifted his gaze from his untouched plate of food, the intricate pattern on the porcelain suddenly seeming absurdly frivolous. He looked at Julian, whose eyes danced with a petty, vicarious triumph. He looked at Marcus, the patriarch, whose face was a mask of somber disappointment, a look he had perfected over decades of boardroom negotiations and familial power plays. It was a look designed to convey reluctant authority, to say, "I don't wish to do this, but duty compels me." Finally, he looked at his wife, Serafina. In her eyes, he saw not malice, but something far worse, a complete and utter lack of curiosity. She had already written his story, cast him as a tragic figure in her own grand narrative, and felt no need to read the actual pages of his life. He had been a star when she met him. Liam Hayes, the youngest ever partner at Sterling & Croft, the most prestigious architectural firm in the country. His designs were bold, innovative, and deeply connected to the environment, earning him accolades and the kind of industry buzz that made him a desirable social commodity. Serafina Thorne had been drawn to that light, to the prestige he carried. Their marriage was a merger of his rising creative genius and her family's established financial power. It was, by all accounts, a perfect match. For a time it was. He had loved her ambition, her fire, the way she commanded a room. He had mistaken her obsession with status for a drive for excellence. The first crack appeared 2 years ago. Liam, feeling creatively stifled by the corporate structure of Sterling and Croft, had announced his intention to leave and start his own independent practice. He had dreamed of focusing on smaller, more meaningful projects, specifically in the realm of sustainable design. He presented it to her as an exciting new chapter, a chance to build something that was truly his own. Serafina had stared at him as if he'd announced he was joining a circus. "You're throwing it all away," she had said, her voice incredulous. "For what? To build mud huts in the countryside?" The dismissal was absolute. In her world, you didn't leave the pinnacle of power, you consolidated it. You didn't trade a named partnership for the uncertainty of a solo venture. It was a betrayal of the image she had so carefully curated. From that day forward, the dynamic of their marriage shifted. The respect that had once been the bedrock of their relationship was replaced by a slow, creeping condescension. His home office, once a space she admired, became the hobby room. His long hours were no longer evidence of his dedication, but of his struggle. When friends asked what Liam was up to, she would answer with a theatrical sigh. "Oh, Liam is trying to find himself, artistically. It's a difficult process." She positioned herself as the patient, long-suffering wife, supporting her husband through a whimsical and ultimately doomed midlife crisis. The humiliation was rarely overt, like tonight. More often, it was administered in 1,000 smaller doses. It was in the way she'd take his credit card at a restaurant, saying with a bright, false smile, "Don't worry, I've got this," as if he couldn't possibly afford the meal. It was in the way she'd started managing their joint account, scrutinizing every expenditure with the air of an auditor examining a failing business. "Are we sure we need this, darling?" she'd ask, holding up a receipt for a book on structural engineering. Liam had borne it all with a quiet, unnerving patience. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply retreated into his work. What Serafina and her family never bothered to ask, what they were too blinded by their own prejudices to even consider, was the nature of that work. They assumed he was scrambling for small residential jobs, perhaps designing a kitchen extension for a suburban family or a new deck for a friend. The truth was monumentally different. Shortly after he left Sterling and Croft, Liam had been discreetly approached by Elias Vance, a reclusive tech billionaire famous for his eccentric and wildly ambitious ventures. Vance wasn't interested in another glass and steel skyscraper. He wanted to build the future. He had purchased a vast, remote stretch of coastline and envisioned a new kind of community, a series of self-sustaining, carbon-neutral ecodomes that would integrate seamlessly with the natural landscape. He didn't want a firm. He wanted a single, visionary architect. He wanted Liam Hayes. The contract was signed under a strict non-disclosure agreement, a condition that suited Liam perfectly. For 18 months, he had worked in secret, pouring all his creative energy into the Ethelgard project. He was not just the architect, he was the master planner, the visionary, the central pillar upon which Vance's multi-billion-dollar dream was being built. The payments were staggering, deposited not into the joint account that Serafina monitored like a hawk, but into a new corporate entity he had established with the help of a shrewd and discreet lawyer. He was no longer just wealthy, he was in a different stratosphere of financial independence, a reality so far removed from his wife's perception of him that it felt like a parallel universe. He let her believe he was struggling. He let her play the role of the benevolent provider. He watched as her pity for him grew in direct proportion to her ignorance of his success. It was a calculated risk. He wanted to see if the woman he had married still existed beneath the brittle shell of social ambition. He wanted to know if her love was conditional on his perceived status. Tonight, he was getting his answer. The leather folio on the table contained the final schematics for Ethelgard's central biosphere. but tucked inside its front pocket was a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a certified statement from his corporate bank account. The foundation of the Thorne family's arrogance was their company, Thorne Industries, a sprawling conglomerate that had dominated the regional manufacturing sector for 3 generations. It was old money, solid and respectable, but in recent years it had begun to stagnate. Marcus Thorne, a man who saw business as a form of combat, had decided on a bold, aggressive move to reinvigorate their legacy. A hostile takeover of their younger, more innovative rival, Apex Dynamics. The deal was everything to them. It was the topic of every conversation, the source of their tension, and the fuel for their hubris. They spoke of it in terms of conquest, of destiny. Liam, sitting in the periphery of their lives, couldn't help but overhear the details of their strategy during hushed phone calls and frantic weekend meetings at the house. As an architect, his mind was trained to see structural integrity, or the lack thereof. And in their plan, he saw fatal flaws. They were over-leveraged, relying on a complex chain of financing that was precarious at best. They were underestimating Apex's defensive capabilities, viewing their rival's leadership as weak when in fact, they were cunning. He saw the whole edifice of their ambition as a poorly designed building, destined to collapse under its own weight. He said nothing. It was not his place, and more importantly, they would never have listened. To them, he was the man who couldn't even manage his own career. What could he possibly know about a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition? His own world, by contrast, was built on a foundation of solid steel and meticulous planning. The Ethelgard project was a marvel of modern engineering and sustainable design. He spent his days in his hobby room, surrounded by 3D models, environmental impact reports, and complex structural calculations. His calls with Elias Vance were not about bluster and conquest, but about precision, innovation, and a shared vision. "We're not building structures, Liam," Vance had told him in one of their first conversations. "We're building a new way of living. This isn't about profit, it's about a legacy of responsibility." The words had resonated with Liam, reaffirming his decision to leave the corporate world behind. He was creating something of lasting value, something that would endure long after the petty squabbles of families like the Thornes had faded into irrelevance. This secret life was a source of quiet strength. While Serafina was sighing over a grocery bill, he was authorizing wire transfers for geological surveys and material sourcing that cost more than her car. While Julian was mocking his lack of a real job, he was collaborating with the world's leading experts in renewable energy and hydroponics. The dramatic irony was so thick he could almost taste it. He lived in a house where he was seen as a failure, while quietly orchestrating one of the most ambitious architectural projects of the century. As the Thorne family's takeover bid grew more desperate, so too did their need to project an image of unassailable strength and unity. This was where Liam became more than just a disappointment. He became a liability. The final piece of the humiliation puzzle had been put in place a week before the dinner. Serafina had approached him in his office, a sheaf of papers in her hand. Her expression was one of strained seriousness. "Liam, we need to talk," she began, a preamble he had come to dread. She explained that as part of the final financing for the Apex deal, the bankers wanted assurances. They were scrutinizing every aspect of the Thorne family's financial health, and that included, however tangentially, him. "It's just a formality," she said, sliding a document across his desk. It was a post-nuptial agreement. It was a brutal document, drafted by the Thorne family's lawyers, that essentially required him to waive any and all future claims to any wealth generated by Serafina or her family from that point forward. It was a legal document codifying his status as an outsider, a non-contributor. "It's to protect the deal," she explained, avoiding his eyes, "to show the bankers that everything is clean, that there are no potential claims on the new assets." The insult was breathtaking in its audacity. She was asking him to legally affirm his own worthlessness to her family's future. He read the document slowly, the dense legal jargon a stark contrast to the simple, ugly message it contained. He looked up at her, expecting to see some flicker of shame, of regret. He saw only impatient resolve. She needed his signature to smooth the way for her family's ambition. He picked up his pen. "Of course," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Whatever you need." He signed his name with a steady hand. He knew, as did his lawyer Ava Chen, with whom he had been meeting for months, that the document was largely symbolic and likely unenforceable in its current form. But signing it was the final test. It was the ultimate proof that to his wife, he was not a partner, but a problem to be managed. He folded the signed agreement and tucked it into his leather folio, right next to the bank statement. He was ready for the dinner. The evening of the dinner arrived cloaked in a sense of foreboding. The air in the Thorne mansion was electric with a mixture of anxiety and forced celebration. The family was on the precipice of what they believed would be their greatest triumph, the finalization of the Apex Dynamics takeover. They were waiting for confirmation of a crucial bridge loan, the last piece of financing needed to execute the hostile bid. The celebration was premature, a performance of confidence intended to convince themselves as much as anyone else. Liam's presence was a dissonant note in their symphony of self-congratulation. Serafina had insisted he come, not out of any sense of marital duty, but because his absence would raise questions. He was a prop, there to complete the picture of a stable, supportive family. She had even laid out his suit for him, an older one from his time at Sterling and Croft, a subtle reminder of the man he used to be, the man she wished he still was. "Try to look cheerful, darling," she had instructed him as they drove over in her sleek, new German sedan, a car she had bought herself, a fact she mentioned frequently. "Tonight is important for my father." The dinner itself was an ordeal of carefully veiled insults and condescending pleasantries. Marcus held court at the head of the table, pontificating about vision and legacy, all while pointedly avoiding Liam's gaze. Julian, ever the provocateur, made a show of asking Liam for his professional opinion on the new wing they were planning for the local museum. "Though I suppose you're more into smaller scale stuff these days, aren't you? Decks and patios, that sort of thing?" The jab was met with a ripple of polite, cruel laughter. Liam simply smiled and said, "I'm more focused on foundational integrity, Julian. It's surprising how many grand structures are built on sand." The comment flew over their heads, lost in their fog of arrogance. They were so convinced of his irrelevance that they couldn't even recognize a warning when they heard one. The tension mounted with each course, a slow, agonizing climb towards the inevitable confrontation. The main course was served, an elaborate dish Liam knew cost more per plate than what Serafina assumed he earned in a week. It was then that Serafina, emboldened by her brother's taunts and her father's silent approval, decided the time was right to deliver her prepared speech. She placed her fork down with a delicate clink, drawing the attention of the table. "You know, we're all making sacrifices for this deal," she began, her tone dripping with false sincerity. She spoke of the long hours her father was working, the stress they were all under. She was painting a picture of a family united in noble struggle. And then she turned to Liam. "And that's why it's so difficult when one member of the family isn't pulling their weight. When they become," she paused, searching for the perfect, cutting word, "a financial burden." The words hung in the air, glittering with malice. It was the culmination of 2 years of slights, of condescension, of pity. It was the final, formal declaration of his worthlessness. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder. The flicker of the candles seemed to slow down. Liam felt a profound sense of clarity, the kind that comes when a complex equation is finally solved. He didn't feel anger. He felt release. He reached for the leather folio beside him, its worn surface cool beneath his fingertips. Inside lay the two documents that defined the two realities of his life: the post-nuptial agreement that codified his wife's contempt, and the bank statement that quantified his secret triumph. The performance was over. The truth was about to take the stage. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Serafina watched him, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She believed she had finally broken through his infuriating calm, that her words had landed with the intended force. She expected an argument, a denial, perhaps even a desperate plea. She was prepared for an emotional outburst, which she could then calmly manage, further cementing her position of magnanimous control. What she did not expect was the quiet deliberation with which Liam acted next. He met her gaze, and for the first time all evening, she saw something other than placid endurance in his eyes. It was not anger or hurt. It was an unnerving, analytical focus, the look of an engineer assessing a critical point of failure. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming a final calculation. Then he turned his attention to her father. Marcus Thorne, the great patriarch, cleared his throat, sensing a shift in the room's atmosphere. He decided to reinforce his daughter's point, to bring the family's authority to bear. "Liam, this is difficult, I understand," he began, his voice a low rumble of feigned sympathy. "But Serafina has a point. We must be practical. Your situation, it reflects on all of us. Appearances matter." "Appearances," Liam repeated softly, the word hanging in the air. "Yes, they certainly do." His movements were economical, precise. He opened the leather folio. The first document he removed was the post-nuptial agreement she had forced him to sign. He did not look at it. He slid it smoothly across the polished wood of the table until it stopped directly in front of Marcus. "I believe this is what you wanted," Liam said, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the suddenly silent room. "A formality, to protect the deal." Marcus picked it up, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He saw the signature at the bottom. The problem had been managed. The liability had been contained. He folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket, a gesture of finality. Julian grinned, raising his glass in a silent toast to his sister. They had won. They had put the help in his place. But Liam's hands had not left the folio. He reached back inside and drew out a single sheet of paper, folded into a neat rectangle. It was crisp, white, and utterly unassuming. This, however, was not slid towards Marcus. He held it for a moment, his eyes on his wife. "This," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in, "is what you need to see." He placed it on the table and, with a flick of his finger, sent it gliding across the wood to Serafina. She looked down at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. What was this? A letter? An apology? A list of his meager assets to plead his case? A smirk touched her lips as she reached for it, the gesture languid and dismissive. She was already composing her response in her head, something kind but firm, acknowledging his effort but reaffirming the reality of the situation. She unfolded the paper. Her world tilted on its axis. The document was a certified bank statement, issued that very morning. But it was the number at the bottom, under the heading, "Closing Balance," that made the air leave her lungs. It was a string of digits so long it seemed impossible, a number that did not compute with the reality she had constructed. It was astronomical. It was absurd. For a moment she thought it was a joke, some kind of pathetic, photoshopped forgery. But the bank's letterhead was authentic, the certification stamp was embossed, and the signature of the branch manager was clear. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of her struggling, artist husband with the 9-figure sum printed on the paper in her trembling hand. The smirk on her face had long since vanished, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. Her face, which she held with such careful control, went through a rapid, visible transformation, from arrogance to confusion, from confusion to shock, and finally from shock to a pale, sickening dread. The foundations of her world had just been liquefied. Julian, seeing the color drain from his sister's face, grew impatient. "What is it? Let me see." He snatched the paper from her grasp before she could react. He scanned it, his eyes widening. His bravado, so effortless moments before, evaporated completely. This, this is impossible," he stammered, looking at Liam with a new, fearful expression. "This is fake. Where did you get this money?" The question was an accusation, a desperate attempt to force reality back into its familiar shape. Liam didn't look at Julian. His eyes were still on Serafina. He began to speak, and the quiet authority in his voice commanded the absolute attention of everyone at the table. "It's not fake, Julian. It's the initial capital payment for Phase 1 of the Ethelgard project." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, knowing it meant nothing to them. "For the last 18 months, while you all assumed I was designing patios, I have been the sole lead architect and master planner for what will be the most advanced sustainable community in the world. My little freelance business, as you call it, is a corporation that currently holds more liquid capital than Thorn Industries has seen in a decade." He let that statement settle, watching as the implications dawned on their faces. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. "I also know that your financing for the Apex deal is dependent on a bridge loan from Sterling Mutual Bank. And I know that loan is anything but guaranteed. You're over-leveraged, and your bid is built on a house of cards." He knew this because his own corporation now held a significant, non-voting stake in that very same bank, a strategic investment advised by Ava Chen. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. The financial burden they had sought to formally cast out of their gilded circle was, in fact, the only person at the table standing on solid ground. The lions were suddenly trapped in the cage they had built for someone else, and the quiet creature they had been tormenting was holding the key. The immediate aftermath was a cacophony of shattered composure. Serafina stared at the bank statement, then at Liam, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, dawning humiliation. The narrative she had so carefully crafted for the past 2 years had been obliterated in less than 2 minutes. The husband she pitied, the man she had branded a failure, was not just successful, he was powerful in a way she couldn't even comprehend. The pity she had lavished on him now felt like a grotesque joke she had played on herself. "Liam, I don't understand," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. It was the first time he had heard genuine uncertainty in her voice in years. Julian, recovering from his initial shock, defaulted to aggression. It was the only language he knew. "You deceived us. You let us believe. You were lying this whole time," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Liam. He was trying to reframe Liam's quiet endurance as a malicious act, a deception, because the alternative, that they had been blinded by their own arrogance, was too galling to accept. But it was Marcus Thorne, the old patriarch, who had the most dramatic reaction. The blood had drained from his face. He understood power, and he recognized it instantly. He saw not just the money, but the strategic mind behind it. In a breathtaking pivot, his expression shifted from stern disappointment to a warm, avuncular concern. He let out a short, forced laugh. "Liam, my boy, it seems there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he boomed, his voice unnaturally jovial. "A simple family squabble. You always were the quiet one, keeping your cards close to your chest. A brilliant move, a true strategist." He was trying to rewrite history in real time, to co-opt Liam's success as something he had always known was possible, to absorb this new, powerful Liam back into the family fold. Liam watched them all, his expression unreadable. He had seen enough. He pushed his chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the marble floor, echoing in the tense silence. He stood up, and in that simple action, the entire gravitational field of the room reoriented around him. He was no longer the guest, the outsider. He was the one in command. And now he would deliver his list of grievances. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough. "There has been no misunderstanding, Marcus," he said, his voice as calm and unyielding as granite. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering for a moment on each face, forcing them to meet his eyes. "For 2 years I have lived in this family and been treated not as a partner, but as a project, a disappointment to be managed." He turned to Julian. "You mocked my work. You never once asked a single, genuine question about what I was doing. You just saw an opportunity to feel superior." He then turned to Marcus. "You judged me on the balance sheet you thought I had. You saw my departure from Sterling and Croft not as an act of courage, but as a failure of ambition. Your ambition." Finally, his gaze settled on Serafina. The analytical coldness in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly, replaced by a profound and weary sadness. "You called me a financial burden. Tonight, at your family's table. You did it to impress them, to solidify your place in their world by casting me out of it." He let the truth of that statement hang between them. A marriage is supposed to be a partnership, a sanctuary. You turned ours into a performance for an audience of two, your father and your brother, and in your play, you cast me as the fool. He paused, looking at her beautiful, stricken face. "The performance is over." He placed his napkin neatly on the table, turned without another word, and walked out of the dining room. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor was the only sound, each one a hammer blow to the crumbling edifice of the Thorne family's pride. He didn't look back. Liam walked out of the Thorne mansion and into the cool night air, feeling not triumphant, but hollowed out. The confrontation had brought no joy, only a grim sense of finality. He got into his modest 4-year-old sedan, another object of Serafina's silent scorn, and drove away, the grand, brightly lit house shrinking in his rearview mirror. He did not go home to the house he shared with his wife. He went to a sleek, minimalist apartment hotel in the city center, a place he had kept for months for late nights of work and as a contingency for this very moment. The consequences of that night began to ripple outward the very next morning with astonishing speed. As Liam had anticipated, the Thorne family's bid for Apex Dynamics was fragile. Their entire strategy hinged on the successful acquisition of the bridge loan from Sterling Mutual Bank. Liam made a single, discreet call to his lawyer, Ava Chen. He didn't need to give explicit instructions. He simply updated her on the events of the evening. Ava, a woman of formidable intellect and fierce loyalty, understood the strategic implications immediately. Within hours, through channels she had cultivated, a quiet word reached the risk assessment department at Sterling Mutual. It wasn't an accusation or a threat, merely a suggestion that they perform a deeper, more thorough due diligence on Thorne Industries' current financial stability and the personal guarantees of its principals. Faced with even a hint of instability, the already nervous bankers balked. The bridge loan was officially denied, citing unforeseen market volatility and increased risk exposure. The collapse of the deal was immediate and spectacular. Thorne Industries stock, which had been artificially inflated by the takeover rumors, plummeted. The business media, smelling blood, pounced on the story of the failed hostile bid, framing it as a classic case of hubris, of an old money giant overreaching its grasp. Marcus Thorne's reputation as an infallible corporate titan was shattered overnight. The family, which had been on the verge of its greatest triumph, was now facing financial ruin, forced into a humiliating scramble to sell off assets to cover the massive losses incurred by their failed venture. Serafina's reaction was a storm of digital desperation. Liam's phone lit up with a relentless barrage of texts and missed calls. The messages were a chaotic whirlwind of emotions. First came the anger. "How could you do this to us? You sabotaged my family." Then came the pleading. "Liam, please, we can fix this. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it." Then, the accusations again, mixed with confusion. "Was this all a game to you? Were you planning this all along?" He read none of them. He simply watched the notifications pile up, each one a testament to her complete inability to comprehend what had actually happened. She wasn't apologizing for her behavior, but for its consequences. A few days later, she appeared, unannounced, at his home office. She had used her key to get into the house, a house that now felt cold and foreign to her. She had always called it his hobby room, a small, dismissive name for the space where he tinkered. When she opened the door, she stopped dead. The room had been transformed. One wall was covered in floor-to-ceiling schematics, detailed architectural drawings of structures so futuristic and complex, they looked like something from science fiction. The desk was gone, replaced by a massive digital drafting table displaying a rotating 3D model of a breathtaking coastal landscape dotted with glowing biodomes. Scale models of the buildings, intricately detailed, sat on illuminated pedestals. It wasn't a hobby room, it was the nerve center of a global-scale operation. It was a room that radiated genius, ambition, and a level of success that made her family's provincial manufacturing empire seem small and insignificant. Liam was standing by the window, looking out. He had heard her come in but didn't turn around. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling. I saw the news. My father." She took a step towards him, her hand outstretched, as if to touch his arm, to re-establish a connection that had long since been severed. "We can help him. You can help him." And there it was. Even now, faced with the undeniable truth of his success, her first instinct was to see him as a resource, a tool to fix her family's problems. He finally turned to look at her. His face was calm, his eyes clear. "There is no we, Serafina," he said, and the quiet finality in his voice was more devastating than any shout. "You made that clear a long time ago." In the weeks that followed, the Thorne family's world continued to unravel. The sale of their assets was a public humiliation, picked apart in the financial press. They had to sell their vacation home in the south of France, then a significant portion of Marcus's art collection. The social invitations, once a constant flood, slowed to a trickle. Their friends, members of the same elite circle, distanced themselves from the scent of failure. For Serafina, this was a death by 1,000 cuts. Her entire identity had been built on the twin pillars of her family's wealth and social standing. With both crumbling, she was left in a terrifying void. Marcus Thorne, a man unaccustomed to asking for anything, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He tried to approach Liam not as a father-in-law, but as a businessman. He left a message with Liam's lawyer, Ava Chen, proposing a mutually beneficial business proposition. He was hoping for a bailout, an infusion of cash from the man he had so recently dismissed. Ava relayed the message to Liam without comment. Liam's response was simple: decline the meeting. The rejection was absolute. There would be no negotiation, no rescue. The Thornes would have to face the consequences of their own actions. Stripped of her wealth, her social status, and the comforting armor of her arrogance, Serafina was forced to confront a reality she had spent her entire life avoiding: herself. She spent days wandering through the now cavernous rooms of her parents' mansion, a place that no longer felt like a castle, but a tomb. The objects that had once defined her, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the art, now seemed like hollow artifacts from another life. Her reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger. For the first time, she began to look inward. She replayed the last 2 years in her mind, but this time without the filter of her own self-importance. She remembered Liam's quiet patience in the face of her condescension. She remembered his steady, unwavering dedication to his work, which she had dismissed as a whim. She saw, with horrifying clarity, that his success hadn't been a secret he kept from her, but a reality he had protected from her judgment. He hadn't deceived her, She had simply refused to see him. One evening, sitting alone in the silent house, she did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She took out a pen and a simple sheet of stationery. Not a text, not an email, but a handwritten letter. The words came slowly, painfully. She didn't make excuses. She didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. She simply wrote the truth. She apologized for her blindness, for her cruelty, for worshiping the false idols of status and appearance. "You were never the burden," she wrote, a tear splashing onto the paper. "The burden was the world I tried to force you into. I was the burden." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Liam stood on a windswept cliff overlooking a pristine coastline. The air was crisp, tasting of salt and wild thyme. Below him, the first of the Ethelgard ecodomes was rising from the earth, its geodesic framework gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was a testament to his vision, a structure of profound strength and beauty, born from patience and purpose. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It was the deep, resonant satisfaction of creation, of bringing something new and meaningful into the world. His lawyer, Ava Chen, walked up to stand beside him. She held a familiar leather folio in her hands. She was more than his lawyer now. She was a trusted friend, his unexpected ally who had helped him navigate the treacherous waters of his old life and emerge into this new one. "The final papers," she said softly, handing him the folio. "Are you sure?" He took it, his fingers tracing the worn leather. He looked from the documents to the structure rising against the horizon, a perfect union of human ingenuity and natural grace. He thought of the man he had been, enduring slights and silent dignity. He thought of the man he was now, the creator of this new world. The past was a foundation, but it was not a place to live. He nodded, a slow, certain movement. "I'm sure," he said. The future was waiting to be built. Months later, the world had caught up with Liam's vision. The Ethelgard project was a global sensation, featured in magazines and documentaries, lauded not just for its architectural brilliance, but for its revolutionary approach to sustainable living. It became a symbol of a more hopeful future, and Liam Hayes was hailed as a visionary. He had moved permanently to the coast, living in the first completed residential dome, a space filled with light, clean lines, and a sense of profound tranquility. He had found his fulfillment not in the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but in the quiet joy of his work. The downfall of the Thorne family was a distant, fading echo. One afternoon, while sorting through some old papers, he came across Serafina's letter. He read it one last time. Her apology felt genuine, born of true loss and painful self-reflection. He felt a pang of sadness for the woman she might have become, for the marriage that might have been, but no anger. He folded the letter and placed it in a box of things from his past. He bore her no ill will, only a sense of sad finality. He had moved on, and he hoped, for her sake, that she could find a way to do the same, to build a new life on a more solid foundation. The story of Liam and the Thorns became a quiet lesson, a modern fable whispered in boardrooms and at dinner parties. It was a story about the profound difference between perceived value and true worth. It served as a stark reminder that true strength is not loud, but quiet. It is not demonstrated through dominance and condescension, but through patience, integrity, and the unwavering pursuit of one's purpose. The loudest voices, as Liam had learned, often belong to those standing on the hollowest ground. True power lies not in tearing others down, but in the quiet, methodical work of building a better reality, a stronger foundation, a more beautiful structure. It is the power of the creator, not the critic. Liam's story is a testament to the fact that dignity is a shield that can withstand the cruelest words, and that the most satisfying vindication is not a shouted retort, but a life well lived, a vision realized. The world may judge you by the title on your business card or the balance in your visible bank account, but your real value is measured in the integrity of your character and the quality of the world you build for yourself. What do you think? Have you ever felt underestimated in your life, only to prove the doubters wrong with your own quiet success? We believe that so many of us have a story like this, a moment where our true worth was finally seen. Share your experience in the comments below. We would be honored to read them. Your stories inspire us and remind us that a quiet heart and a dedicated mind are the most powerful forces for change. If this story of justice and vindication resonated with you, please show your support by giving it a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales that uplift the spirit and champion the underdog. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being a part of our community. Until next time, remember to build your life on the bedrock of your own integrity.